Thank you, Lauren. Thank you to all of you for being here today, and especially a big thanks to Andria, to Candice, to Billy. I'm going to pepper them with some questions, and they'll make their introduction that way, rather than me give you the sort of boilerplate bios. But I thought it might be useful to read the prompt put to us by Talking Galleries before we dive in. They've asked, how can organizations redefine value as intrinsic to relationships and encourage economic growth and development of local communities? And that's ostensibly what the three organizations here today are going to share us, their leaders. We're especially interested in thinking about how this happens during moments of turmoil, and how this all plays out against the larger backdrop of local and international changes, to put it lightly. So to zoom in a little bit further and talk about this field specifically, I think one thing that's worth saying by way of introduction is that there's been a shift taking place in contemporary art, and specifically in the museum and nonprofit sector. Some attribute this to a generational shift. You have people aging out of leadership roles or burning out post-pandemic, and new leadership taking the reins. But whatever the reasons for this general shift, it does seem clear to me that the expectations of what a nonprofit arts organization or museum does, what it can or should offer artists and audiences, has changed. To offer just one very obvious example, there's a perceived need to take even greater social responsibility in one's community, or what some might otherwise deride as being all things to all people. And I hope we can unpack and get into that a little bit. So thus the job of leading a nonprofit organization or museum has changed. And that may be an exciting proposition for some, maybe less for others. With all that comes a wider range of skills, experiences that the most talented directors, which I'm very grateful to share the stage with today, must bring to the job. So by way of introduction, all three of you are relatively new in your positions. I'd say recruited in the last 1 to 3 years, if that's fair. Yeah. Not only that, but the leadership positions you now occupy seem to mark a shift in your own careers. So as a means to introduce yourselves and your organizations to the audience here, I'd like to throw out a few framing questions. So first, just a little bit who you are and the organizations you lead, how you describe your career and your interests, how they landed you at your current organization, and inspired by the Talking Galleries prompt, what shift in consciousness was required of you as you settled into the role. So maybe we can go ABC order, Andria, Billy, Candice, just to get us started.
Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I'm very new to my role. I started last October as head of programs, which is also a new position at Shorefast and Fogo Island Arts, which is a art program within a charity organization called Shorefast, which is based on Fogo Island in Newfoundland, Canada. So quite far away, quite different from where I had been before at the Shed here in New York. I think that there's so many things to unpack in what you just said. It's definitely, I'm in the stage of settling in. It's a very different organization. It has a very radical approach to community economic development. And it's been an organization that has emerged actually out of an artist residency program. So a little bit of a backstory for some context. Fogo Island is a tiny island that is hundreds of years been settled by Irish and English settlers, and who were primarily fishing people, whose livelihood was sort of devastated by inshore fishery mismanagement, and at a certain point the residents of the island were asked to resettle and move to the bigger island. And long story short, many things happened. They figured out a way to work together, create a co-op, and stay. The organization I work for was founded by a woman named Zita Cobb, who is from that island, who had to leave during this turmoil of economic devastation. And she moved to Ontario and began working in fiber optics. She did very, very well and decided that she wanted to move home and build something new that would allow for a sustainable community to exist and thrive. So she decided to build an artist residency program. Not really what probably most business people would say as a beginning point for economic development. But she had a long vision. She still does. She's thinking in a 100-year scale, which is a great way to think about development of any kind. So the artist residency, they're very beautiful studios. They're designed by an architect named Todd Saunders. They're built kind of inside the cliffs and inside the landscape, which is also very beautiful, very severe. But sort of if you've been to, it's like Iceland and Ireland had a baby is probably the best way to describe the landscape. Candice has actually been in residence there. But the residencies became kind of a Trojan horse for bringing people from around the world to the island to understand how special the people are, how special the landscape is, and why it was important to grow something there. Mm-hmm. Then Zita went on to build a luxury inn that you may have heard of called the Fogo Island Inn, which is an incredible experience that brought together artisans from the local community who were boat builders and quilters and rug hookers to work with Scandinavian designers, mostly German designers, to create a kind of very holistic design experience and I would even say wellness experience, even though it's not really like a spa or anything. It's just a very complete understanding of place through an inn. That luxury inn now supports 300 people on the island, allows for complete employment, and funds the charity work of Shorefast, which also runs Fogo Island Arts, which is the residency program that birthed the whole thing. So I got to know Zita and Fogo and Shorefast because I'm originally from Newfoundland, so there's not that many curators from Newfoundland. There's Kitty Scott, who some of you may know. She's our strategic advisor, actually, and I'd gone for a few conferences and spent some time with Zita, but last year when I was home for a visit, we happened to just kind of drop in on Fogo, and I texted her to see if she wanted to have coffee. And we just got to talking, and it seemed like this is a time of inflection for where they're going. They're building a program that not only looks to an international artist residency program as its core, but is building environmental stewardship programs around that, cultural preservation programs, and a real sense of a holistic approach to what true sustainability is. What can you change the parameters or the measuring process of economic development to include things that have different kinds of value. And artists, of course, are really at the core of that. I think I have had a shift in consciousness. I've had a kind of funny career of working in museums and public art, and then I worked in a commercial gallery. So for me, I think it's always been about expanding. Jasmine earlier said some really interesting things that really resonated with me. This idea of, we all got into art because working with artists means you're learning every single time you do a project with a different artist. And I felt like our institutions have kind of become a little bit too narrow somehow. There's not a space to think differently, and there was a lot of windows open in this new kind of space for me. And January, we moved to Fogo Island, which has been a crazy experience, and all other kinds of adjustments about living in a remote northern community. But it's a very powerful project, and it's changing everything about how I think. So yeah, we'll get into it a bit more.
Yeah, let's get into that. I'm sure there are many folks in the room who sometime during the past few years have considered moving to a remote island. Billy, maybe we could turn to you next.
So I'm Billy Tang, the executive director of Parasite. Parasite is in Hong Kong. It was founded in 1996, so just before the handover. So in some ways, a change in landscape, a moment of uncertainty. It was founded by a collective of artists in their 20s. One of the founders told me, like, there's something about the arrogance of youth where the kind of fearlessness of risk-taking, and they decided originally just as a temporary project, which then slowly, in a way, evolved. Maybe I would say it was kind of fascinating that kind of drove the evolution, and in its name as well, it suggests a kind of being in relation to other things, such as the flux of the city, the climate as well. I think it's really interesting that it's kind of responded to kind of different needs. So as artists during that time, Hong Kong at that time probably was described as a cultural desert. It's been a moniker that's kind of been perhaps a little bit unfortunate, and it says a lot about kind of the difference between being inside and outside, and how perspectives can be often skewed. So it was, in a way, the infrastructure as well was, maybe the cultural desert kind of idea was, a lack of museums and the kind of things that we expect from the cosmopolitan city, and a kind of free space as well, a space for experimentation. So kind of from that kind of urgent need, they started with a project, and then kind of evolved through a kind of whole polyphony of different kinds of modes of exhibition making, from just simply having a space, being very grassroots. There's a kind of immediacy when the stakes are kind of low, and then gradually kind of becoming bigger as well, to the point where it also started to receive government funding. So during this process, I would say there was also an interesting kind of shift between being artist-led to a moment when, in a very kind of forward-thinking way, they decided to relinquish the custodianship of the space to a curator. Because again, from the question of what was absent, what was important to address or to support, and they realized also that with curators as well, there was, there wasn't a kind of space for curators to experiment, to think about continuity of the program. Before, it was really kind of my show, your show, in the best of ways. And so I think arguably now it's been sort of in the last decade, has been more kind of curatorially focused in terms of its the practice of contextualizing. It's been a great place to forge constellations beyond established centers of art or reference points in art history, creating alliances. Particularly, I think what's been special as well is how it's kind of operated on a local scale, regionally, in terms of Asia Pacific and how that's understood, and somehow a more general kind of international connection. In the timeline for my own career and how I connect with Parasite, I'm now 2 years into being a director. It's my first director job. I kind of went through an unconventional route. Started as a gallerist. And that was also interesting in a way because when we think about the ecology as well and certain standards of non-profit and commercial, particularly in non-Western kind of context, things kind of operate in a different way. And I've always wanted, in a way, to be a curator, but learning to operate in somewhere such as China, for example, which I've lived in in Beijing and Shanghai, and now I'm in Hong Kong. In places like Beijing and Shanghai, there's no government funding. There isn't that kind of formalized kind of infrastructure to support initiatives to allow them the independence. To be independent, you would have to find ways to self-fundraise, and the most convenient means at that time was through commercial means. But I think this was also kind of given me an interesting idea of certain kind of scales of working, the pros and cons of that, how things are funded, which kind of connects to the idea of value in terms of the freedom to experiment as well from the perspective of an artist, things that kind of go beyond the life cycle of an exhibition, the need for curators also to connect to different audiences, and then I kind of moved to a museum, so that's another kind of scale, another kind of monster in a way, kind of the tempo. And now I'm kind of thinking kind of quite interestingly in terms of in Asia that we've seen actually the closure of some legendary spaces like NTUCCA in Singapore, or Times Museums just kind of come back to the fold but experienced the closure as well. So this is a pioneering space in Guangzhou. So I think a lot about this precarity and Parasite's role now. It's now become one of the oldest institutions in Asia, and how to support and create solidarity, resource sharing, and in a way also thinking between what artists need, what curators need, but also ideas and visions of future institution building as well. So, there's this kind of idea of also of the collective or that shifts in different modalities and kind of goes between different languages. We've also actually, we're not, maybe also an interesting thing to point out as well is like with Parasite, we're not fixed to one building or entity. We've actually shape-shifted. So in the early days, we were in a shop front. Now we're in an industrial building since 2015. It's in a kind of gray area that is, in a way, we've kind of lost the sense of the kind of local public, but we also are able to do things with because we're, in a way, under the kind of less scrutinized somehow. So I'll just leave it there. But yeah, that's to paint the picture as well.
Cool. Thank you. Candice?
So I'll start with a story that might at first sound like it's not related. It was the summer of 2021, and I was living with my husband in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Albuquerque at the time, there were almost, every weekend we could count on being a part of Black Lives Matter protest, but it was also at the same time in parallel the reemergence of what Native activists call the Red Power movement, and that was taking place on the streets of New Mexico, the streets of Albuquerque, the streets of Santa Fe. And we were all reading and thinking, and it was a time of, I think, deep questioning of institutions. It was a time of deep questioning of the value and legitimacy of museums. And it was a deep questioning, I think, of who is in power, how they're governed, how they're funded. And I read this article that I didn't expect to read, and it was on the pages of this, it's both an online and print magazine, but I only read it online. It's called Chronicle of the Horse. Because the way that I funded my grad studies, I grew up on a farm, I sold and trained horses in order to go to Bard. And it was authored by Sophie Gotchman, and she was, I think, 17 when she wrote the article. And she was calling out deep inequities in the equestrian world, and she was inspired by Black Lives Matter movement. She was inspired by social justice. And if any of you know the horse world, I never thought that Black Lives Matter would be even, on those pages of Chronicle of the Horse. After Sophie wrote that article, she received a number of death threats. The magazine backtracked and tried to claim that none of these problems exist in the equestrian world, which I would say is much more inequitable than even the art world. And And then it was about a month later that I got an email about this new organization that had been started just in April of 2021, that at that time they were even questioning the name. It was already called Forge, co-founded by Sophie's mom, Becky Gotchman, and Zach Foyer. And it was profound to me because it was really close to Bard, where I went to school, and a place that I understood, and Forge is an Indigenous organization, of a place of radical displacement, to the point where, Native folks haven't been there and haven't occupied their home villages since the 1700s. And it seems like when there's places of radical displacement, there's a vacuum that's created, and often what comes to fill that void is often a lot of misinformation, or people standing in, or even just complete, amnesia. And I feel like in the Hudson Valley, where we are, it was pretty much complete amnesia. So I received this prospectus, and it was one page. And they had started a few things. There was the beginnings of a lending collection of contemporary Native art. There were these extraordinary buildings that had been acquired that were designed and built in 2006 and 2008 by Ai Weiwei. There was a fellowship that had been started for Native cultural leaders at all stages. So there was someone working at the intersection of law, grassroots politics, and land claims. There was an amazing Indigenous architect. There was an incredible MacArthur Award-winning filmmaker. There was someone who had dedicated their life just in the past 3 years to re-waking up a sleeping language, which is the Mohican language. So Forge is located on the unceded lands of Moh-He-Con-Nuck people. And I thought, this is a really profound model, not only because of where it is, but because right from the start, when they began talking to me about bringing on people who would work for Forge, they said, we're not interested in shaping this in our vision at all. We're, in fact, wanting people to bring on a team who can shape it in their vision. And I thought, what an amazing opportunity, because you often, as you work in museums, you work as a curator. I had been working from project to project on various biennials around the world, and also as part of Documenta. You always inherit a model. So what does it mean to be able to start something in a way from the ground up, to kind of not take on all of the things that we like to criticize as part of institutions, but instead, if we make any mistakes, it's really on us. So they had a lending collection, they had started a fellowship, they also had a collaboration with Sky High Farms. If anyone knows, that's a food security initiative that was started by the artist Dan Colin. And really, their main question was, when we went to meet them the first time, was whether this could work. Were there other models like this? Could this work? Would this be of interest to other people to come to? And can we make an organization that is deeply dedicated to social justice to such a degree that it can also be part of the repair? So I signed on right away. And we've also been working closely with Peter as a colleague to determine, how do we start to evolve? How do we start to evolve in a way that is sustainable, that gives more than it takes, and that starts to reframe our relationships even with larger institutions? And we can share more about that as we go along.
Cool. All right, thank you all for those thoughtful introductions. So just to zoom back up to the top, this panel is titled Organizations as Models for Our Future. I want to say that admittedly I've always been a little suspect of the term models. It sounds to me like there's an off-the-shelf solution, whereas my experience advising organizations, the problems may be common or similar from place to place, but an effective solution is anything but, right? You really need to dive in, understand the particular culture, expertise of an organization. So for example, I often joke, there's no PDF you can download that says how to have a radical board, or if it exists, you should probably not trust it. So when we think about models, I often think about modeling relationships, right? And I think we're hearing this in all of your remarks thus far, modeling different kinds of relationships with artists, modeling different kinds of relationships to donors, to audiences, to land, things that are really important. If we think about like a nonprofit or an institution as almost a pilot project, right? Something that could then enter culture writ large, really influence in a deep way. These are important, right? These kinds of experiments that we're all running here. So I want to dig into this. And I want to say, just to kind of get into this next conversation about models, there's some observable trends I want to sort of lay out here, and we can bat these around. From a vantage point in the field, there are kind of 5 things, not an exhaustive list, but we could talk through a little bit. Things I see sort of organization to organization across landscapes. The first I want to say is the pressure to make the case for the value of arts to society, right? It's no longer a given, even in our capitals like New York or LA and elsewhere, that these organizations just should exist because they're doing God's work or something. The second is integrating progressive thoughts of all kind. For example, I think there's an expectation, arguably, that all these organizations now have a stated position, a clear, bold statement on X issue of the day. The third is a desire to increase social space and other kinds of amenities to engage and grow audiences. So that's maybe a convoluted way of saying the way audiences want to spend time in an organization has changed, right? Not every inch of an institution needs to be programmed, all right? Like a cafe is a very good example of this, but there are other kinds of social spaces, unprogrammed space, that increasingly I think organizations are thinking of. The fourth sort of micro trend I want to throw out there, artists sort of exceeding the gallery space in new ways. And that happens in all different ways, right? Doing things that don't traditionally fit into a gallery space. We're not just talking about painting a sculpture. And we're also, I think, interestingly, talking about artists to use their exhibition opportunities to really bring in their communities, program in really deep ways, right? Many of us walk through the door at once. And then the fifth, and not least, fundraising. A much greater emphasis on values alignment, further distinguishing between governance and fundraising when it comes to boards, and certainly, and I'd love to hear this from you, Candice, also especially, modeling different relationships between donors and organizations. So I've kind of thrown out a lot of talking points, and we can sort of bat those around, but for each of you, I'm kind of curious, any of those trends, sort of how they're showing up now for you in your organizations, and maybe in particular where you felt like the limits of your expertise tested, right? As you've come into these roles, they've marked a shift for you in your organization. How's that challenged you to rethink your own sort of perspective or expectations walking into the role? So, anybody want to jump on that one?
I think this is an interesting, in terms of the scale that you operate on, and within this kind of idea of an ecosystem, you have kind of almost like the big fish, the small fish, and then grassroots organizations. They're often the ones that are working with modest resources, but disproportionately, but probably taking more of the risks in the way of unknown artists, perhaps. And kind of dealing with a kind of precarious situation. And the more established you are, maybe the more that you have the luxury of taking the pickings. And then it kind of maybe translates to an idea of a KPI of markers of value. So there's kind of a big show and maybe a famous artist who and it corresponds to being commercially successful. It's easier maybe for the larger institutions also to kind of get that credit somehow. So a lot of the work for smaller scale institutions is about this kind of, in a way, to prove value. And sometimes it feels intangible because it's maybe the arc of creativity and someone's career and how value generates. It's a bit harder to say, oh, it's this or this. This was successful in that way. And the reason that motivates me as well is the certain degree of a kind of speculative play somehow that things shouldn't be so utilitarian and kind of so kind of like A, B, C, D. And it's about giving trust actually to curators or artists to actually have the confidence to fail.
Right. Yeah, I like that you said that it's often the smaller grassroots institutions that take most of the risks, but I also feel like that's the larger institutions, see those as places of like testing grounds, right? I think for us, in terms of value, what I'm seeing reflected on those who come to visit us, and we're just 90 miles up the Hudson Valley, so you're welcome to come see us, is the value in new models. Because what we realized from the beginning is that we didn't have to do things the way that had happened before. I think we actually have a great deal of flexibility because we're not a museum. We've been thinking a lot lately about the fact that we don't have to have a traditional acquisitions committee, for example. So what we've done instead is we've created a group that we're calling Changemakers for Native Art, because we realize that people want to share knowledge together and they want to make institutional change greater than what we can do at my organization. And with that as well, Peter, you were talking about models, and one of our first questions, and this tested the limits of my knowledge, I'd never founded a not-for-profit before, number one. So we wanted to think of governance very, very carefully, because us as an organization that not only values but enacts Indigenous self-determination, how do we reflect that in our governance model? So we came up collaboratively with this idea that we would have, and we do have, an Indigenous Steering Council, not a committee, because a committee doesn't often have decision-making power. They don't often have teeth. And they're often the people that you ask, for their advice once you've already made your decision. So the Indigenous Steering Council actually sits above the board. It's a 7-member committee and includes folks like Jeffrey Gibson and Sky Hopinka and Peter Jemison. And they really provide the high-level leadership and direction for us. And then we have our board, and they also provide direction for our board. So it gave us an opportunity to kind of rethink the relationships of guidance, relationships of power, of fiducial responsibility, let's say, in an organization. And I feel like it also allowed us to be creative even in committee making. And I think that we can do that. And most recently, we had a meeting just last week with curatorial colleagues from a lot of institutions across New York. And we asked them this question that I think is a really important one, that if you didn't inherit the model that you have, what would you do differently? And I feel like we never get to ask those questions in established institutions. So I think that's one of our roles now, is to ask those questions.
That's so interesting. So Shorefast is only 10 years old. I think that the only constant in that 10 years is that it's very iterative. There's always change happening. There's always a questioning of, is this the right model? Is this doing what we really needed to do? The board at Shorefast is also only governance, not a fundraising board, which is very Canadian, actually. Yeah. Which is an adjustment for me, having lived here for almost 20 years. I'm constantly like, wait, they're not funding us, that we have to find the funding elsewhere. Which is different, right? It's a completely different relationship to how you think about your programming, how you think about your direction, how we're initiating a new advisory council, kind of similar idea. But I think the biggest shift, and probably, I think Shorefast's a pretty radical model to begin with. It's really focused on place-based community development, economic development, and looking at place-based assets and thinking, Zita's goal, the founder, is to change capitalism globally. And she's really going to try. Yeah. But in terms of the work we're doing at the programmatic level, that means that, I'm working on an aquaculture seaweed pilot project to think about, can we grow seaweed on Fogo Island that becomes a product or a carbon offset that we can turn into an asset that would sustain a fisher population after there's no fish. We're working on heritage preservation programs that bring boat builders who are, 7th generation people who would find curved pieces of wood to carve and create these special kind of boats called punts. And how do we take that skill set and turn it into a furniture making business? And how do we preserve this knowledge that's now with, 70-year-olds and bring it to a younger generation? So as a curator, those are very interesting topics, but it's definitely stretching my knowledge base. I don't really know anything about seaweed. Or, what is it called? Eelgrass seining, which is something I learned about. But I think in a way there is this interesting skill overlap in the sense that as a curator, every time you work with an artist, it is a deep dive into a different subject. And really what I'm looking at is how do we create the arc of a program that also tells the story of an approach that can find its way to another place that might be remote or rural or an island or going through economic change. How can we have a kind of consideration set in how we approach all the work we're doing with artists, with scientists, with fishers, as small as things as like our management style and where we choose to purchase things as vendors. How do we put our resources? It's kind of like walking the walk. It's very different because I think in the museum world, there's a lot of conversation, but there's not a lot of, especially when it comes to funding. You have to make these tough decisions and you don't often have the ability to really live your values. And in this kind of model, partially because it's very remote, we have a lot of freedom. We can say, we believe this and we're gonna do it this way.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about the values because one of the things that I saw replicated over and over, especially in art institutions, is we spend a lot of time and energy and effort thinking about what's going on inside our buildings. We think a lot about the exterior of our buildings. We think a lot about the architecture of our buildings. But we don't always think about the place that they're on and the health of that place. And I feel like your organization is only as strong as your relations. Yeah. So what we like to say at Forge now is that we move at the speed of trust. Mm-hmm. And one of the first things that we did, one of the first acts, and it reminds me a little bit of the radical work that happens at Fogo, is we started to take care of the land differently. We sit on 40 acres. We have a creek, Clavera Creek, that runs along the edge of the property. And as Zach Foyer likes to say, when the buildings were acquired, the whole thing looked like a golf course. It was like closely shorn, grass. It was a monoculture. And so we've been working with an allied botanist. We've been working with a medicinal knowledge holder from Stockbridge Munsee community, Misty Cook, as well as an allied landscape architect, to bring back seeds, in some cases some that haven't grown for more than 300 years, to this place. But our first responsibility on this land is to tend it, because we're thinking also, not about 5 years down the road, because organizational lives are very short. Ecological lives and geologic lives are very, very long.
Yeah, it's this holistic approach that you can't really do in a museum.
No.
That's only about art.
Yeah.
It's about putting art sort of in the middle of this bigger conversation.
I want to dig into a few more topics, but quick time check. Loring, how are we doing? Okay? Well. Oh, we did? Okay, great.
Oh, sweet.
35, awesome. All right. So maybe I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. I mean, so for, thinking about models, thinking about what your organizations, your peer organizations can offer the rest of the world, do these things translate? And I guess what of your work so far have you seen translate or have the potential to translate to other institutions or even to other galleries and organizations that make up the larger ecosystem in the art world? Candice, you just mentioned having this sit down with curators from a variety of museums in New York. Were there, you don't have to name names, of course, but were there certain concepts, ways of working that Forge has innovated that when you mentioned them, you immediately saw eyes light up?
That's a good question. Well, I think eyes light up in the flexibility of the model that we have right now and the kinds of collaborators that we can work with, because I feel like, in many ways, art is not just a thing, it's also a methodology. It's a way of kind of looking and acting and being in the world. I feel like one of the things that has been inspiring that I haven't spoken about yet and that we all share is that we also have a residency. We call it a fellowship. We host people for 3 weeks, up to 3 weeks at a time. They really decide when they want to come, and they receive a cash award. But one of the things that we didn't want to do is to kind of add another thing to their plate. So to kind of dictate all of the things that we expected that they would accomplish at the end of that time, because even time is a commodity. And we were very conscious of that, especially when we started in 2021, where we were still quite deep within the pandemic. And there was a lot of pressures on Native leaders and arts leaders, I think, at that moment. So we think of it more like the space for thought, the space for retreat. If someone wants to spend those 3 weeks with family, so be it. They can do that. And it reminded me somewhat, too, of the 5 weeks that I spent at Parasite, where I had been invited by the former director, Cosman, and they also didn't do that. All they did was try to be a good host and set up certain relationships for me while I was there. And I wrote, I met people, I witnessed things, but I didn't feel this kind of pressure of production that come with a lot of residencies. And I feel like that is an extreme privilege.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting connection between the three organizations. It's very unique. I didn't realize that was also the case at Parasite.
It was the inspiration for our collaboration, actually. It was like how, this idea of a generative approach to things that, and a kind of flow rhythm that can take its natural course, people to people, practice to practice. So you were involved also with the conference as well, which was a big kind of gathering, an international gathering of researchers, writers, thinkers, artists and curators. So there's kind of all these kind of scales that kind of feed into one another as well. And I really was really inspired by Cosmin actually and how he pioneered an approach that maybe it's something like 2016 was a very, a residency, but then eventually they would co-create maybe a triennale in the case of Hitman and Shalasha from Nepal. And before that was the model, as it will, if you will, was kind of tested through an exhibition that toured to different places around the world as well. So there's kind of scales in different ways. And I think in terms of this kind of notion of also something ad hoc, where things can be a bit more intuitive and embraced. Yeah. And sometimes it's needed something a bit more formal to kind of specify a structure of core concerns and how they kind of flow between these kind of different ways. I think that's something that I take on board as well. And so with the residency with Fogo Island as well, there's also dealing with a lot that Hong Kong has changed. Lots of people have left. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's also been embedded in the history as well. It's really important to remember. It's not just this moment. There's actually been in mainland Canada, like a long history as well with Hong Kong in terms of migration. Mm-hmm. And to see if we could embrace that in a way that ideas should be free to migrate, and there are different kind of conversations in a generative way that can build up. And our hope actually from this collaboration is knowledge and experience will be kind of fed back to Hong Kong as well. Maybe if you want to
Yeah.
share a
So
bit
for
about that.
those of you who don't know, we just announced a partnership, which Lauren didn't know anything about when she invited both of us. Fogo Island Arts and Parasite have launched a new residency collaboration called the Fog and Mist Residency. Our Fogo Island Arts director, Claire Shea, actually worked previously at Parasite, so had a lot of knowledge of the space, and so we will welcome our first Hong Kong-based artist this summer, and there's a mentorship component with Mocha Toronto, with Billy, with our team on Fogo Island, and hopefully some other people. So it's really this question of hosting people and hospitality, I think, is so important to all of our work because we really want to give people an exceptional experience. I think there's a lot of talk in museums about care,
Yes.
but I like the word hospitality a little better because we're really, creating an experience that people walk away from. Like, how do we give people a piece of a place? And that is a gesture of care, but it's also, I think it does have some structure, it does have some intuitiveness, but it's also about, holding people.
Yeah. Yeah, we think about that a lot. We actually have protocols that we enact at Forge.
We have some protocols.
Where
not quite rules,
we
but-
don't host people without offering refreshments and food, and
Yeah.
because that's just part of being a good person and making people feel welcome. We know that if they've come to Forge, they've probably traveled a fair bit to get there. But the other thing that we're extra conscious of is the specificities of place where we are. We are on, I'm a citizen of Carcross Tagish First Nation, but I'm not from the lands that Forge is on, so I'm essentially an uninvited guest. But we've been working really closely with Stockbridge Munsee community, and they're the original folks who are from that area of the Hudson Valley who were removed a total of 7 times, all the way finally to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
So we now have a partnership, a formal diplomatic relationship with them, a signed MOU, which just passed tribal council last month. It was 1 year in the making. So yes, you move at the speed of trust, even if that takes longer than the time frame that we are used to in art. But we have another program where we've been welcoming folks back to their homelands, and that comes with a real sense of responsibility, especially for a place that's become quite radically gentrified. It's really hard to find a place to stay there or afford a hotel. But when they come, we've actually been stocking the cellar so that when people come, they have things from their homeland, things that are made from local plant life. There's a garden at another home that we maintain that's there that's just for them. So we do a lot of activities that are deliberately also not public. And I feel like a lot of times in museums, you don't often have the privilege of doing completely private events, ones that are just for community and not necessarily for donors. Because often there's always a pressure to really either perform or make public all of your actions. For us, sometimes the strongest and best relations are those that we do, just for Indigenous folks, just for community folks, and things that we're never going to try to leverage for, other means.
So important, and it's also something I'm learning living on Fogo Island. Fogo Island has 2,100 people, and most of the people living there are maybe like 5th, 6th generation, and their way of life is very important, and there's a lot of people who come from away that kind of step in and are, even though I'm from Newfoundland, I'm not from that island. And what does it mean for me to bring artists from around the world to that community? How do we create authentic moments of engagement that move at the speed of trust and, honor all the people in the mix? And it has to move a lot slower than I'm used to. I'm in a process of slowing down.
One of our key terms here is value, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves and the audience that defining value differently is one of the primary reasons nonprofits exist. The idea just being that we're at our best when we create value that cannot be as easily measured, say, in dollars on the traditional marketplace. That doesn't mean we're disconnected from the market entirely, and I'd love to talk about that with all three of you more. But again, we're often in the business of piloting new ideas, untested ways of working, in your cases, with artists. So, specifically, I'd love just to hear from each of you, like, how you really define that. And I don't mean like in the space of a grant report or the language on your website, but when you get up each day, who do you think, okay, this is who we're here to like move the needle for? If I get nothing else done, we're thinking about this group or maybe even this individual and what we need to achieve foremost for them. Big question, I know.
It is.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. I mean, I think a lot about how to go beyond like extracting value, like extractivist kind of mentality, and I think that's kind of also twin to maybe another, maybe older model of an institution that kind of territorializes things that it wants to gather in terms of reputation, being the first, and so forth. And I think from an ecological point of view, it's just no longer sustainable, mentally, physically, in terms of workload, but also in terms of environmentally as well. When I think about, so Parasite actually is, it's known for being an exhibition-making institution, and that's been the main kind of area of visibility. And I think it's wasteful in a way that there's so much investment, and then when the exhibition closes, there's a kind of amnesia that kicks in. I think a lot about how to switch from kind of extracting and being the first to thinking more generatively as well. And in terms of also how things are changing, I think the idea of solidarity as well, beyond kind of your immediate place, enables you to kind of thrive and kind of it creates kind of interesting alliances in that way, and resource sharing and knowledge sharing that kind of helps to replenish things that kind of things that you take. So I think a lot about that as a model. I don't know if I have time to talk about a specific project, but there is an exhibition that will be in MoMA PS1 in October with Enzo Camacho and Amy Lien. And what I found really fascinating about that as well is it's a project that kind of looks at the histories of plantations and actually how it kind of continues in kind of models of exploitation in the present, and how these kind of cycles of destruction kind of, from in this case specifically in the Philippines, kind of has consequences globally as well in terms of mass exodus of the diaspora, who often are in cities working as domestic labor workers or in other effective industries, such as entertainers, for example. And that's very much like something that is very close to home in Hong Kong, where it's the biggest ethnic minority. The Filipino is the Filipino community. So it's kind of moving these conversations as well and amplifying them that I find very valuable and makes me wake up every day to do my job.
All right. Candice and Andria, I want to make sure we get to you.
Yeah.
And Lauren's giving me the 5-minute signal. Okay, cool.
Okay. I'll be short. In the community where I come from, we define value or wealth, in fact, which shouldn't necessarily be conflated by how much you can give away. So I feel like that is a kind of ethic that we move with, along with the ethic of hosting. But in terms of, I'll give one specific example, because in terms of the lending collection that we have, I want the lending collection to be considered kind of part of the public trust for a number of reasons. One is to enable accessibility. We loan out at any given time, about 30% of our collection is on loan. but also to try to fix the valuation gap that exists between native contemporary art and other contemporary art, especially artists of certain peers, certain career levels. So we work behind the scenes a lot to be corrective in that way, and our co-founder, Zach Foyer, works very hard in that. But I also feel like value is often gained when you challenge its conventions. So we do that through, enabling ethics of hospitality so that it's not territorial, it's not extractive. Just as you were saying, Billy, I feel like we can gain a lot by, having a practice, not just a discourse of generosity.
In terms of value, I think at Shorefast, there's two different systems at play. One is related to community economic development, where there's some realistic measurements like population growth, how many babies were born this year, how many people moved to the island, how many people left, GDP and employment stats. Those things are quite real when you're thinking about how much change you're impacting on a place. But I think more holistically, the value in our approach and our consideration set is really around how much we can integrate everything that we're doing like a quilt weave that's horizontal. Our environmental work is not separate from our cultural preservation work or our foodways program. And none of that is separate from what happens when an artist is on the island and how do they experience the place. But Peter, your question about who do you serve when you wake up in the morning, I think it's a really good one, because I think a lot of what we're trying to do is obviously serve the community that we're in, and our local community is very important, but at the same time, there's a constant oscillation between working locally and reaching out to an international community so that our work is relevant beyond the borders of a very tiny place. And so part of my work is always operating at two different scales and thinking in two different ways at the same time, which is really interesting and also sort of the ethos of the organization. So it's I would say I'm working hard not to have a hierarchy of audience so that artists and community members and chefs and scientists are all the same level of importance of who we're talking to, which is complex, actually. Yeah.
We have time for one more, Long?
Yeah.
Okay. We're at Talking Galleries. So, with a sense of audience in mind, I'll throw out like another light provocation, and then maybe we could bat it around. But, I'd say there's a sense, arguably right now, that a major institutional show by an artist no longer directly correlates with an increase in value for their work on the market, or at least it ain't what it used to be. And that this untethering, as I'll call it, has created a bit of anxiety on both sides of the fence, the commercial, the nonprofit side. And maybe the system as we know it's beginning to, I don't want to say decohere, but it's beginning to change a little bit. So feel free to challenge that, I guess. Firstly, in your perspective, has the relationship between institutions, and especially your institutions, and the market changed? And then secondly, maybe how you're navigating that right now.
Mm-hmm. I disagree with you.
Go for it.
I'm just going to jump in there.
Please.
I think that the market of artists is still increasing after major institutional shows. Like, look at Pasita Abad. I'm sure her prices have increased over the last year. I think, maybe it's a different question. Maybe it's about the quality of the exhibition or the status of the institution or, how much of a PR machine was behind the exhibition. I think it still serves to give the artist visibility. It gives the artist an opportunity to work in a different context, which allows for, potentially a different way of showing their work that also allows collectors to see it in a different way. You can't say that if you have a MoMA show, your work prices are not going to increase. I don't see that change as so radical as like an untethering. I think it's still important. I mean, maybe it's not important if an artist has a show on Fogo Island, but if an artist has a show in New York or San Francisco or Chicago or Toronto, that has an impact in their collectability.
Mm-hmm. I think for us, what we're witnessing is a kind of corrective moment, certainly for the market of contemporary Native art, and one that's been happening really rapidly over the last 5 years, but certainly over the last couple of years. And I feel like we have a responsibility in that, you know, the majority of Native artists self-represent. They still self-represent. Very few have a commercial gallery, and if they have, those are pretty new relationships. So the work that we're doing right now is, in fact, a lot of mentoring of how to navigate that system, which for some artists is really new and doesn't have a lot of guideposts, and they don't have a lot of mentors who've been a part of it. But in terms of the monographic show, this is what I've been trying to say for, you know, some people see that as this kind of moment, you know, like an example of, you know, a Native artist getting a major exhibition might mean that this might change the field of Native art. But for me, what it does, that's fine, it does, it can. But it often cuts out the relations and the community that artist is a part of. And I feel like sometimes it doesn't, it does a bit of a disservice because it tries to elevate a single person instead of the conversations that this person has generated, in some cases over 30 or 40 years. So it kind of gives a false view onto their practice. And I feel like it's inherently a kind of colonial view of, you know, how you advance an artist's career. Mm-hmm. So we're interested in kind of even questioning that very structure, that inherent structure, and its relationship to the market.
So with Parasite, I think how we retain our autonomy and independence and critical thinking is somehow to, I mean, it's always kind of constantly shifted in a kind of changing landscape. I mean, there was a moment where maybe you could say there wasn't so much of a market, to then suddenly Art Basel moving into Hong Kong, and you can see really, you know, it kind of dramatically changed things, the city, for good or bad in a way. I mean, mainly for good, I would say. And one of the biggest kind of fundraising kind of channels for us is the auction from our gala, which happens once a year. But before that, there was many other kind of initiatives, and depending on the kind of different scales that we operated in. So yeah, it's something that, in a way, is a balancing act and it's a kind of dance in a way. But what I take out from how Parasite has had this resilience and continue to evolve is to always kind of revisit the model and reinvent yourself. So it means also in the way that we do programming. We're actually going through a moment now where traditionally we were kind of exclusively doing group exhibitions on a particular scale, and now kind of focusing sometimes on commissions, which is often kind of has an intimate conversation that opens up from that process. So it's becoming a bit more diverse, and that kind of translates into the idea of scalability that allows us resilience, allows us to be agile, and also hopefully to kind of think about different ways that support happens in the peers and kind of helps to contribute to how we sustain ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Ready, Lauren? Cool.
Does anybody have any questions? Questions? Yes.
Hi. This is the most simple and basic of questions, but for Candice, how does one visit the Forge.
Oh,
So I have a house in the Hudson Valley, and I know,
Yeah.
I've known you guys were up there, but I really didn't know how to access you.
yeah, there's a few different ways. So we have monthly community days. That's a really good way to come and visit. You can come with a group. You can also simply just email us at our info@email. All of our emails are on our website. So also unlike other museums, we don't hide our emails. So mine's up there too, so you can email me. And then you can come visit. We like to do tours. So yeah, you're welcome.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? I have a question. I was wondering if each of you could, if you had to tell like a larger institution something that you've learned now from your experience at your institutions, something that you think that they could do that could implement change for good, what would that be?
I have one. Yeah. So it's a model that Peter, we're on it, that we've started at Forge, and that is that any tour that we give, we ask for a donation to Forge, but we give an equal donation to Stockbridge-Muncie community. So and that's part of our reciprocal relations. It's part of our, in a way, paying our dues. But I would encourage any museum who cares at all about their relationships with Indigenous people, and if they're on unceded land, to consider giving back part of their admissions. It's simple. It is actually, it's possible. So that's one thing.
I'm thinking.
Me? Yeah. On that note, we also, Parasite also has tried to pioneer schemes that think about support beyond kind of exhibitions and artistry primarily. So we also helped with kind of medical support or insurance. And I think that's an interesting conversation as well about what is kind of better practices now. And I was on a studio visit earlier today, and even something like a contract that seems innocent and innocuous, but is often always kind of geared towards how the organization thinks and defines how the labor is understood and where value is derived and the responsibilities from the other side, but less so about, as an institution, what we are responsible, accountable for, and how to have that conversation. It's something that it inspired me to think about that as something that I will take when I go back home.
I feel like I'm in a really deep learning moment 3 months in, but I think this idea of having a really long-term perspective that goes beyond the directorship of whoever's in charge, like thinking really about what is your institution's future beyond your current team, even if it's just that far ahead. I think that institutions get really focused on what's happening right in front of them, and it's this kind of hamster wheel that you lose sight of that, future that allows you to really build and do good work.
Okay, one more.
Testing.
Okay. You guys have all created these really beautiful structures, obviously, and you've articulated your values really well. I wonder if you could just talk briefly about the process of uncovering that. Like, who did you work with? Was your board involved? Were these councils involved? Like, how did you surface all of that? What was the process?
Yeah, I can begin. We evolved. We started simply as a private LLC because it was the fastest way to get off the ground and get working and make a difference. I feel like one of the benefits that we had, in fact, was not all of the staff came from an arts background. Some people came from journalism. Some people had, one person on our team has a seat on city council. Another came from art and tribal governance. So we had that variety of perspectives. And then we slowly started asking people that question of, if we're to transition, what kind of model do we want to transition to? And I feel like that was also a moment of privilege where a lot of organizations already, I think that they know what kind of model they want to be. And then we were able to put in the first part of our governance structure, which was the council, and build that first, even before the board. So that was a kind of another point of privilege. We worked with this is a shout out to an incredible consulting firm that's led by Peter, in fact. But we talked to as many people as we could who had, in some cases, decades of experience. And I feel like if we hadn't have done that, we wouldn't have been as set up as we are. So, and all of those people were incredibly generous with us. So that's how we did it. We did it very, very slowly and carefully. We're building our board very slowly and carefully right now, too.
I guess with Parasite, it's like 27 years of history, and it's kind of, in a way, its kind of reputation, and it's so close and cherished to many people's hearts. And so I just can share that there's a lot of pressure to be a custodian of that legacy. Mm-hmm. And it's a kind of humbling process for me as well, because in a way, there's just this magnitude of things that have happened in the past, and it's really difficult. It's been a challenge for me also to think about what things I can change, and how to honor the history. And I think in a very simple kind of way of thinking about this, and to share that, is the best way to honor that was also its spirit, is kind of, which I find it has been a kind of courage and boldness. To embrace the unknown. It sounds very generalized, but it's just something that keeps me going. Yeah. To take the risk when, in the scheme of things, where things feel precarious, the tendency is maybe to kind of stay to something that's known, and to kind of retain and to remain static with something that you know that works. But I'm trying to kind of have that mentality to somehow, in a way, be brave and have that courage. Another thing is, naturally, it's kind of, I think, the complexity of what we're facing, like it goes beyond one individual, and how to decentralize that in a way. And it means like working together. And I think I really loved what you talked about in terms of not always having things so public facing all the time, because of course, there are certain conversations that unfold with this, but behind closed doors, like it's important to have that safe space as well, and amongst our peers. So even things such as like MOUs, when we're talking about like partnerships, or through these kind of things, we start to really understand the values of the other side, and that kind of is something that continues as well beyond the project.
I'm learning how Shorefast was built, but from what I'm gathering, a lot of things were tested. It was a lot of piloting. There's sort of an allergic reaction to strategic planning, and Zita, the founder, has an incredible vision, and it's really focused on doing. So we've tested a lot of things and tried it out, and there's not a fear of failure. Things can not work, and we can try it a different way and try it again a different way. And sort of, she likes to say, a small island is a good proxy for a small planet. And so you can really, try out different ways and see what sticks and what feels right, and always, taking in that kind of consideration set of ethos that dictates what you're doing. So as long as you have that in place, this kind of iterative process has led us to where we are now. I'm sure it'll change a lot even in the next year. Yeah.
Thank you so much. A big round of applause. Thank you to Billy and to Candice and Andria and Peter. Thank you so much for being here.